Okay, so today I'm going to be talking you through chapter one of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Story of the Door. What I'll do is start off by reading the chapter to you, and then I'm going to talk you through this PowerPoint, which will correspond to the booklet that's been uploaded to Google Classroom. Okay, chapter one, Story of the Door. Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile. Cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beckoned from his eye. Something, indeed, which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in these silent symbols of the after-dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. He was austere with himself, drank gin when he was alone, to mortify a taste for vintages, and though he enjoyed the theatre, had not crossed the doors of one for 20 years. But he had an approved tolerance for others, sometimes wondering, almost with envy, at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds, and in any extremity inclined to help rather than to reprove. I incline to Cain's heresy, he used to say quaintly. I let my brother go to the devil in his own way. In this character, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of going down men. And to such as these, so long as they came about his chambers, he never marked a shade of change in his demeanour. No doubt the feat was easy to Mr. Utterson, for he was undemonstrative at best, and even his friendships seemed to be founded in a similar catholicity of good nature. It is the mark of a modest man to accept his friendly circle ready-made from the hands of opportunity, and that was the lawyer's way. His friends were those of his own blood, or those whom he had known the longest. His affections, like ivy, were the growth of time. They implied no aptness in the object. Hence, no doubt the bond that united him to Mr. Richard Enfield, his distant kinsman, the well-known man about town. It was a nut to crack for many, what these two could see in each other, or what subject they could find in common. It was reported by those who encountered them in their Sunday walks that they said nothing, looked singularly dull, and would hail with obvious relief the appearance of a friend. For all of that, the two men put the greatest store by these excursions, counted them the chief jewel of each week, and not only set aside occasions of pleasure, but even resisted the calls of business, that they might enjoy them uninterrupted. It chanced on one of these rambles that their way led them down a by-street in a busy quarter of London. The street was small and what is called quiet, but it drove a thriving trade on the weekdays. The inhabitants were all doing well, it seemed, and all emulously hoping to do better still, and laying out the surplus of their gains in coquetry, so that the shop fronts stood along the thoroughfare with an air of invitation, like rows of smiling saleswomen. Even on Sunday, when it veiled its more florid charms and lay comparatively empty of passage, the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighbourhood, like a fire in a forest, and with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased the eyes of the passenger. Two doors from one corner, on the left hand going east, the line was broken by the entry of a court, and just at that point, a certain sinister block of building thrust forward its gable on the street. It was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story, and a blind forehead of discoloured wall on the upper, and bore in every feature the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and disdained. Tramps slouched into the recess and struck matches on the panels. Children kept shop upon the steps. The schoolboy tried his knife on the mouldings, and for close on a generation, no one appeared to drive away these random visitors, or to repair their ravages. Mr. Enfield and the lawyer were on the other side of the by-street, but when they came abreast of the entry, the former lifted up his cane and pointed. "Did you ever remark that door?" he asked, and when his companion had replied in the affirmative, "It is connected in my mind," added he, "with a very odd story." "Indeed?" said Mr. Utterson with a slight change of voice. "And what was that?" "Well, it was this way," returned Mr. Enfield. "I was coming home from some place at the end of the world, about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, and my way led through a part of town where there was literally nothing to be seen but lamps. Street after street, and all the folks asleep. Street after street, all lighted up as if for a procession, and all as empty as a church. Till at last I got into that state of mind when a man listens and begins to long for the sight of a policeman. All at once I saw two figures, one a little man who was stumping along eastward at a good walk, and the other a girl of maybe 8 or 10, who was running as hard as she was able down a cross street. Well, sir, the two ran to one another naturally enough at the corner, and then came the horrible part of the thing, for the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. It sounds nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man, it was like some damned juggernaut. I gave a view halloa, took to my heels, collared my gentleman, and brought him back to where there was already quite a group about the screaming child. He was so perfectly cool, and made no resistance, but gave me one look so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running. The people who had turned out were the girl's own family, and pretty soon the doctor, for whom she'd been sent, put in his appearance. Well, the child was not much the worst, more frightened, according to the sawbones, and there you might have supposed would be an end to it. But there was one curious circumstance. I'd taken a loathing to my gentleman at first sight, and so had the child's family, which was only natural. But the doctor's case was what struck me. He is the usual cut-and-dry apothecary, of no particular age and colour, with a strong Edinburgh accent, and about as emotional as a bagpipe. Well, sir, he was like the rest of us. Every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw that sawbones turn sick and white with the desire to kill him. I knew what was in his mind, just as he knew what was in mine. And killing being out of the question, we did the next best. We told the man we could, and would, make such a scandal out of this as should make his name stink from one end of London to the other. If he had any friends or any credit, we undertook that he should lose them. And all the time, as we were pitching it in red hot, we were keeping the women off him as best we could, for they were all as wild as harpies. I never saw such a circle of such hateful faces, and there was the man in the middle, with a kind of black, sneering coolness, frightened too, I could see that, but carrying it off, sir, really like Satan. If you choose to make capital out of this incident, said he, I'm naturally helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene, says he. Name your figure. Well, we screwed him up to £100 for the child's family. He would have clearly liked to stick out, but there was something about the lot of us that meant mischief, and at last he struck. The next thing was to get the money, and where do you think he carried us but to that place with the door? Whipped out a key, went in, and presently came back with the matter of £10 in gold and a cheque for the balance on Coots, drawn payable to bearer and signed with a name that I can't mention, though it's one of the points of my story, but it was a name at least very well known and often printed. The figure was stiff, but the signature was good for more than that, if it was only genuine. I took the liberty of pointing out to my gentleman that the whole business looked apocryphal, and that a man does not, in real life, walk into a cellar door at 4 a.m. and come out with it with another man's cheque for close upon £100. But he was quite easy, and sneering, set your mind at rest, says he. I'll stay with you till the bank's open and cash the cheque myself. So we all set off, the doctor and the child's father and our friend and myself, and passed the rest of the night in my chambers. The next day, when we had breakfasted, went into a body into the bank. I gave the cheque myself, and said I had every reason to believe it was a forgery. Not a bit of it. The cheque was genuine. Tut tut, said Mr Utterson. I see you feel as I do, said Mr Enfield. Yes, it's a bad story, for my man was a fellow that nobody could have to do with, a really damnable man, and the person that drew the cheque is the very pink of the proprieties, celebrated too, and, what makes it worse, one of your fellows who do what they call good. Blackmail, I suppose. An honest man paying through the nose for some of the capers of his youth. Blackmail House is what I call that place with the door, in consequence. Though even that, you know, is far from explaining it all, he added, and with the words fell into a vein of musing. From this, he was recalled by Mr Utterson, asking rather suddenly, And you don't know if the drawer of the cheque lives there? A likely place, isn't it? Returned Mr Enfield. but I happen to have noticed his address. He lives in some square or other. And he never asked about the place with the door, said Mr. Utterson. No, sir, I had a delicacy, was the reply. I feel very strongly about the putting about of questions. It partakes too much of the style of the day of judgment. You start a question, and it's like starting a stone. You sit quietly on the top of a hill, and away the stone goes, starting others, and presently some bland old bird, the last you would have thought of, is knocked on the head in his own back garden, and the family have to change their name. No, sir, I make it a rule of mine. The more it looks like Queer Street, the less I ask. A very good rule too, said the lawyer. But I've studied the place for myself, continued Mr. Enfield. It seems scarcely a house. There is no other door, and nobody goes in or out of that one, but, once in a great while, the gentleman of my adventure. There are 3 windows looking on the court on the first floor, none below. The windows are always shut, but they're clean. And then there's a chimney, which is generally smoking, so somebody must live there. And yet, it's not so sure, for the buildings are so packed together about that court that it's hard to say where one ends and another begins. The pair walked on again for a while in silence, and then, Enfield, said Mr. Utterson, that's a good rule of yours. Yes, I think it is, returned Enfield. And for all that, continued the lawyer, there's one point I want to ask. I want to ask the name of that man who walked over the child. Well, said Mr. Enfield, I can't see what harm it would do. It was a man of the name of Hyde. Said Mr. Utterson. What sort of man is he to see? He's not easy to describe. There is something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarce know why. He must be deformed somewhere. He gives a strong feeling of deformity, although I couldn't specify the point. He's an extraordinary-looking man, and yet I really can name nothing out of the way. No, sir, I can make no hand of it. I can't describe him. And it's not want of memory, for I declare I can see him in this moment. Mr. Utterson walked some way in silence, and obviously under a weight of consideration. Are you sure he used a key? He inquired at last. My dear sir, began Enfield, surprised out of himself. Yes, I know, said Utterson. It must seem strange. The fact is, if I do not ask you the name of the other party, it's because I know it already. You see, Richard, your tale has gone home. If you've been inexact in my point, you'd better correct it. I think you might have warned me, returned the other with a touch of sullenness. But I've been pedantically exact, as you call it. The fellow had a key, and what's more, he has it still. I saw him use it not a week ago. Mr. Utterson sighed deeply, but never said a word, and the young man presently resumed. Here is another lesson to say nothing, he said. I'm ashamed of my long tongue. Let us make a bargain never to refer to this again. With all my heart, said the lawyer. I shake hands on that, Richard. Okay, so moving on to task 5 in your booklet then, based on the reading of chapter 1. So the first task then asks you, who is Mr. Utterson and what does he do for a living? And what incident does his friend Mr. Enfield witness? So you can find the information about Mr. Utterson and what he does for a living in the very first the first paragraph of the chapter. So have a reread of the first sentence, okay, and that tells you what Mr. Utterson does for a living. And then question 2, you want to have a look on page 3, if you've got a physical copy of the reading. If not, then it's where Mr. Enfield starts talking when he says, well, it was this way, returned Mr. Enfield. I was coming home from some place at the end of the world, about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning. And then Mr. Enfield goes on to tell Mr. Utterson all about what he witnessed on that night when he was out in Soho in London. So have a reread of that and you should be able to find out what Mr. Enfield witnessed. The clue is to look for the description of the man that appears and what happens with the child. Okay, on to the next part. We've got Meet Mr. Utterson. So Mr. Utterson is a really important character in this story. The story follows him. It's not told directly from his point of view, so it's not first person, but it does follow him throughout. So he as a lawyer, which you would have picked up on for task 5. He's like the detective in the story, so he pieces together all the parts of the narrative to solve the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So he uses lots and lots of different evidence from different people throughout the novella to piece together what happened to Dr. Jekyll. So the third bullet point now we've got, he first hears the story of the incident at the door from his friend Enfield and links the stranger in the street to his good friend Dr. Jekyll. So the incident at the door is the trampling of the young girl from Mr. Hyde. And we can see, although it's not explicitly said, that this stranger, this strange deformed man, is linked with Dr. Jekyll. It's not explicitly said, but we can infer that Mr. Utterson believes that Mr. Hyde is blackmailing Dr. Jekyll, which was quite a common thing to happen in the Victorian era, and people could threaten to expose you for all sorts of things. And because of the obsession with reputation in the Victorian era, quite often people would blackmail others for all sorts of things, whether it be homosexuality, for example. It was quite commonplace. So Mr. Utterson describes Mr. Hyde going into a house, into the door, and in the Victorian era, it was really hard to see where one house ended and another began. If you think of houses with lots of terrace streets on, there are quite a few Victorian terraces in Gosport. For example, if any of you know Park Road, that is by the lake, there's lots of Victorian terraces down there. And particularly in London, it was hard to tell where one house ended and another begins. So Mr. Hyde disappears into this door after he tramples the young girl and comes back out with a cheque. And it's signed by someone who's described as being the pink of the proprieties. Now, if you're the pink of the proprieties, that means you've got a really good reputation. So straight away, Mr. Utterson, as a lawyer, as a legal man, panics and thinks, why is this, deformed man that's just committed this atrocity, why is he disappearing, apparently into the home of Dr. Jekyll? And he jumps to conclusions, which he does a lot in the novel, and thinks it must be blackmail. So the task here for Meet Mr. Utterson says, read the following extract and highlight lines you think are important in presenting Utterson as rational. So rational meaning that he thinks logically, kind, that he's truthful and a trustworthy friend to someone that characters confide in. So it's important that we trust him as a reader as well. So we've got, why do you think it's important that Utterson is a lawyer? So just have a reread of the extract that's on the screen now, that's in your booklets, and try and find some quotes that show that he's rational, so he thinks logically, and that he's all of those things that are highlighted. Something that's useful to note at the bottom there, we've got, in Gothic text, the main characters often presented as very rational, but they will have this tested as the story takes them on a journey into the supernatural. Now, you'll know from your reading on context that Jekyll and Hyde is quite a Gothic text. It's got elements of the supernatural. So, like I said earlier, sometimes Mr. Utterson jumps to conclusions, and that can sometimes test our trust in him. But it is important that, to a certain extent, we see him as trustworthy. So it's important that he's a lawyer, because lawyers are seen to be quite logical, quite rational, and quite trustworthy because of the position they play in society, getting justice for people and making sure that the legal system works properly. Mr. Utterson is meant to be generally a likeable character, and his characteristics, he's rational, kind, truthful and trustworthy, and hopefully you've managed to pick out a few quotes there for that. Okay, moving on to task 6. So we've got the extract about Mr. Utterson again, that you would have just looked at for your previous task. So we've got, how is he presented in these quotations? Can you label some of the methods? So remembering our subject terminology, some of the methods used by Stevenson to introduce his character. So some of them are picked out there for you. you may or may not know, Victorian texts are quite typically very descriptive, so they are heavy on the adjectives. So there are lots of adjectives to have a look out for regarding Mr Utterson in this extract. Got some metaphors, so line 3, something eminently human, beacon from his eye. The verb, he was austere with himself, so if he's austere, it means he's quite strict with himself. And we've got his affections, like ivy, were the growth of time, so we've got a simile there as well. But you want to be thinking, what effect do these methods have on our first impression of Mr Utterson in chapter 1? Be aware as well that the language in Victorian text is sometimes a little bit more challenging, so don't be put off, and do use the internet to help you as well, but do have a look at the quotes that are highlighted here. Just a general recap for Mr Utterson, as I know some of you will want to build up character profiles as you go. So there's a list here of the general characteristics and personality of Mr Utterson for you to refer back to. Task 7 is looking at setting in chapter 1. So setting is really, really important in Jekyll and Hyde in terms of the theme of duality, so the idea that there are two sides to everyone and everything. It's important in terms of the gothic and supernatural atmosphere that Stevenson builds up in the novel, and you can definitely be asked about how Stevenson uses setting in the exam. So task 7 then, I've just put a little bit of extra information there at the top for you, but we've got in chapter 1, Mr Hyde uses a back entrance to Dr Jekyll's house. Mr Hyde lives in Soho. Now, Soho in today's society is known as quite a, what's the word I'm looking for? Quite a modern area of London, quite a desirable area of London to be in. But in the Victorian era, so in 1886 when the novel was published, Soho had a really, really bad reputation. It was overpopulated, it was run down, it was poverty stricken, there was lots of cholera outbreaks. If you don't know what cholera is, might not Google image it, you might be in for a bit of a shock, but it's a really nasty disease. There was lots of immigrants. The Victorians were known as being very prejudiced and very racist. That caused quite a divide. And there was a lot of prostitution because of the poverty and overpopulation. There weren't enough jobs. So that's what Soho was like when Stevenson published the novel, and that's where Mr Hyde lives. So where Mr Hyde lives is contrasted with the kind of road that the door is off. So be thinking about how Stevenson describes the door and what it suggests about Mr Hyde, the person living behind it, or the person that uses the door. So what I've done is picked out some key quotes for you. So we've got things like this sinister block of building. So think about the connotations of the word sinister. The fact it was 2 stories high but showed no window. So why might a building not have a window? What might they be trying to conceal? The fact that the wall's discoloured. If it's discoloured, what does that suggest? Well, to me, it suggests neglect, that no one is, paid any attention. The fact that there's no bell or a knocker. So what does that suggest about the people that live inside if there's no way of getting the attention of the inhabitants? Do you think that's done on purpose? And the fact that the door is blistered and disdained. So again, there's that sense of real neglect. And the fact there's tramps in the recess as well. So tramps are just inside the doorway, sitting there. So again, what this description suggests about the person living there and how Stevenson builds this description of the door. Why do you think he opens the story with this story of the door straight away? Okay, so we've got extract 6, the story of the door, and in this there are key quotes picked out, as you can see. Extract 6 links with a series of 9 questions. So you want to work your way through those questions. So why is it frightening at the beginning of the extract? How do we know that Mr. Enfield's afraid? Number 2, what's horrifying about the man's behaviour? So what does he do? And think about the target of his attack. How the crowd react and how they feel. So they react in a very peculiar way, and have a think when you figured out how they react. What is it about Mr. Hyde that's made them react this way? What they threaten to do if he doesn't pay £100. So they say they'll make his name stink from one end of London to another. So you think, what does that mean? If you threaten to make someone's name stink, what are they threatening to do? Why the cheque he gives them is suspicious. So if you've been listening carefully, I have made reference to that. But yeah, the cheque is suspicious because of who it came from and because of what Mr. Hyde is like. Then we've got word of the day, juggernaut. So have a look up what the definition of a juggernaut is. You may already know, but if not, do use Google. And then I want you to use it in a sentence and how it's used in chapter 1. Do have a think why Mr. Hyde might be described as a juggernaut in chapter 1, because it does contrast the reality of what he's actually like. So have a think why Stevenson may have chosen to use such a word when actually it juxtaposes the reality of Hyde's physical appearance. And then we've got read the story of Cain and Abel. So that's on the next slide, but just below the question in your booklets. And think, what does it mean when Mr. Utterson says he inclines to Cain's heresy in dealing with others? So all you need to do is, where's that gone? Sorry, it's not copied and pasted over. All you need to do though is have a read of the story of Cain and Abel in your booklets and have a think, why does Mr. Utterson says he inclines to Cain's heresy? Task 9, we've got an image of evil. So this one is kind of getting you to think a bit more abstract. So what does evil actually look like? And how you'd capture that in a story. Now, quite often, if any of you watch crime documentaries, you'll find that when there are criminals, quite often people say, but I didn't realise that so-and-so was evil, that they did the things they did. So have a think about how Stevenson captures that in chapter 1 of Jekyll and Hyde. Then we've got look at the quotations from the extract you've just read. And some of the quotations are listed below. Think, how does Stevenson seem to introduce the reader to a character who's pure evil? So highlight the words you find powerful and explain the effect and what language techniques have been used. So just to talk you through the first one, the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming. Now, if I were to analyse this quotation, straight away I'd pick out the oxymoron trampled calmly. So you've got the verb trampled and the adverb calmly. Now, when I think of the verb trampled, for me, that's got connotations of an animal, of something that is out of control, something that is angry. But then after that, Stevenson uses the adverb calmly. So it challenges what we normally associate with the verb trampled. So the fact that he does this, that Mr. Hyde does this, suggests to me that he is almost like an animal in his behaviour, but like an animal, he feels no remorse about what he's done to this child. So, quite often people say that animals don't have the conscience or the emotional intelligence that humans have. So the fact that he's described as being able to trample calmly kind of links to that idea that Mr. Hyde is like this degenerate, that he's slightly devolved, that he feels no emotion, he has no conscience about what he's just done. And the fact that it says he left her screaming, again, it kind of enforces to us that he feels no remorse for this. He doesn't go back and see if she's okay. He just leaves this child on the ground in the middle of the night. If you wanted to look at this quote further as well, you could think about the fact that Stevenson describes him as the man. So the noun man takes away identity. It makes Mr Hyde mysterious. It kind of gives this sense of evil. He's this unidentifiable presence. No one's really sure who he is. Mr Enfield says at the end of the chapter, I can see him clearly in my mind, but I can't think of how to describe actually what he looks like. And that links to this idea that he's just labelled as the man rather than anything else at the start. So that's how I'd analyse that first quote. But if you go through the remaining ones underneath and have a think, what words are powerful and how does this show that Mr Hyde is evil? And there's the story of Cain and Abel. Sorry guys, it's on slide 11. So I'm just going to move that back up to where it needs to be. There we go. Okay, and then finally, we've got task 10, read the following extract from the story of the door. So again, just rereading this bit, guys, and then having a look at the 3 questions. So why do you think the man is so difficult to describe, despite making people hate him on instinct? So what is it about this character that means he's not easy to describe? There's something wrong with him. It's not so much as it's not all about what he looks like. It's about this feeling that he gives people that make people hate him. But they're not 100% sure why. It seems to be a mix of things. So yeah, I think why do you think the man is difficult to describe? Number 2, what do you think makes him appear deformed, even though there's no obvious physical deformity? Now, in the Victorian era, there was a branch of science, look into it if you want to, but the Victorians were really interested in kind of what we call pseudosciences, so sciences that don't necessarily have 100% proof behind them. They're sometimes seen as a bit more kind of creative science is perhaps one way of putting it. But one of the sciences that the Victorians really gave credit to was something called physiognomy. That's spelled Physiognomy, if you want to look it up. But they felt that you could tell by someone's facial features if they were a criminal or a bad person, which to a modern reader seems a little bit crazy. But in books, etc., if you were to look it up, you could see the types of facial features that the Victorians thought were features of a criminal's appearance. So even though Mr Hyde's got no physical deformity, there is something about him, some kind of issue with his appearance, something that's horrible, that make him appear deformed. Now, remember, it could go beyond his physical appearance. While he may not be physically pleasing to look at, sometimes from people, you can, get a bad feeling. So have a think about what Stevenson does to suggest that Mr Hyde has this strong feeling of deformity. Is it something that comes from within Mr Hyde that makes him appear deformed? It's not all on the outside. Think about what it could suggest about his character on the inside. And then finally, typo there. What do you think Enfield and Utterson, why do you think Enfield and Utterson decide never to speak about this again? How does this reflect the gentleman's code? So why do you think the 2 men are scared to talk about it? Why do they say, with all my heart, I shake hands on that, Richard? What do you think Mr Enfield is worried about? Why do you think Victorian gentlemen were worried about asking questions? Okay, so that is chapter 1 in a nutshell, and hopefully me talking you through those tasks will help you complete the questions on chapter 1 that you can submit on Google Classroom. Just to give you a quick summary again of chapter 1. So we've got Mr Enfield tells Mr Utterson that he saw Mr Hyde knock down and trample upon a young girl late at night. Hyde was pressed into giving compensation for her injury, and then Mr. Enfield realises that Mr. Hyde is an acquaintance of Dr. Jekyll. But then at the end of the chapter, the two men agree not to talk about it again. Okay, hopefully you found this useful. As I said, be sure to submit your work onto Google Classroom, and when you're done, I have uploaded some advice guidance if you're a bit like me and struggle a bit with Google Classroom, but do give me an email if anything's unclear. As you know, my email is acarter@bayhouse.gfmat.org. Okay, take care everyone.